She heard the laughter before she heard the words. 3 men had courted Lydia Hartwell, and 3 men had walked away, the last one loud enough for the whole town to hear. She's too much woman to carry through life. Now her own brother was selling her off to a rancher people whispered about in fear, a man who'd buried his family and his mercy in the same grave. As her wagon climbed toward the mountains, Lydia believed she was being thrown away like a sack of spoiled grain. She had no idea she was riding toward the only person alive who would ever see her worth. Stay with me to the very end of this story. Hit that like button and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The morning Tobias Hartwell told his sister she was leaving, he did it with his back turned, scraping the last of the cornmeal mush from the pot like the words cost him nothing. Pack what you can carry. Mercer's man comes for you Thursday. Lydia stood in the doorway with a basket of eggs warm against her hip, and for a moment she thought she'd misheard him over the wind worrying at the loose shingle they'd never gotten around to fixing. She set the basket down on the table. One of the eggs rolled to the edge and she caught it without looking, the way she did everything in that house, automatically, hands always working ahead of her thoughts. Mercer's man, she repeated. Caleb Mercer, out past the Granite Pass. Tobias still wouldn't face her. He needs help with his place. Cooking, hens, the garden. Real work. He's agreed to take you on and feed you, and that's more than this house can keep doing. Take me on. She heard her own voice go flat and careful, the way it did when she was furious and trying not to be. Like a hired hand. Like a hired hand. Now he turned. Tobias was 26, 2 years younger than her, with their father's heavy jaw and none of their father's patience. And he looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post that's rotted at the base, an inconvenience he'd been meaning to deal with. What did you think it'd be, Lydia? You think there's a line of men at the door I'm turning away, after Harlan? She didn't answer. They both knew about Harlan. Harlan Voss had courted her for 6 weeks the previous autumn, walking her home from the Saturday market with his hands clasped behind his back like a preacher, talking about the parcel of bottomland he meant to buy and the house he meant to raise on it. She'd let herself imagine that house. She'd lain awake imagining the kitchen window and where the light would fall in the mornings. And then on a clear, cold day in November, outside Pell's Mercantile, with half the town within earshot, Harlan had told his friend Dewey Crane, not quietly, never quietly, men like Harlan never said the cruel things quietly, that he'd reconsidered the Hartwell woman, that she was sturdy enough, sure, good hands, good back. But a man wants to come home to comfort, not to a draft horse in an apron. She's too much woman to carry through life. I'd be tired by 40. Lydia had been standing close enough to hear it. Harlan had known she was close enough to hear it. She had not cried. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the small flint of pride she'd struck against the dark of that winter. She had not cried in front of him. She had walked into Pell's and bought the flowers she'd come for and counted the change twice and walked the 1.5 miles home with her chin up. And then she'd gone out to the woodshed and split kindling until her palms bled. And only then, in the dark with the axe handle slick in her grip, had she let herself shake. He was the third. Before Harlan, there had been Eli McComb, who'd vanished to Oregon without a word the spring after he'd kissed her by the river. And before Eli, when she was 19 and soft and stupid with hope, there had been the Pruitt boy, who told her father he'd think on it and then married Sue Ann Catchings inside the month. 3 men. The town kept count the way it kept count of everything: births, deaths, debts, disgraces. Lydia Hartwell, 28 years old, rejected 3 times, sturdy as an ox and twice as plain, the woman everyone had decided was simply too much. Too tall? Too broad through the shoulders. Too quick with an opinion. Too plain in the face, with a jaw that some women could carry and she apparently could not. Too capable, which men seemed to like in a hired girl and hate in a wife. She had a laugh that came up from her belly, and a temper she'd learned to fold down small, and a habit of saying the true thing when the polite thing would have served her better. All her life, people had looked at her and seen too much, and now her own brother was looking at her and seeing the same. "You owe money," she said. It wasn't a question. Tobias's eyes flicked away again. "The Hendricks notes come due, and there's the seed loan, and Maggie's expecting again. So Mercer's paying you. He's paying what's fair for the work. He's paying you, for me." Lydia? How much? Her voice didn't rise. That was what frightened him about it. She could see the fright in the way his shoulders came up. How much am I worth to you, Toby? Round figure. He told her. The number was smaller than she expected, and somehow that was the worst part of the whole morning. Worse than the suitors. Worse than the laughter outside Pell's. Worse than the basket of eggs cooling on the table. She had spent her whole life working that farm. She had buried their mother and nursed their father through the consumption that killed him and run the house and the garden and the hen house and half the field work besides. And she had been worth, to the only blood she had left in the world, a number a man could clear in a season if the rains came right. Thursday, she said. Thursday. She picked the egg back up off the table and set it gently in the basket with the others. And she did not split kindling that night because there was nothing left in her to shake out. The man who came for her on Thursday was old and bent and bone quiet, a hired drover named Ferris with one milky eye and a face like a dried apple. He didn't say more than 10 words the whole way, and the ones he did say were about the weather and the road. Lydia sat beside him on the wagon seat with her 2 carpet bags between her feet, everything she owned in the world, which was clothes and her mother's sewing kit and a tin of letters from a cousin in Missouri she hadn't heard from in years, and a Bible she packed out of habit and not faith, because faith was one more thing the last few years had worn down to nothing. Maggie had come out to see her off, the baby on her hip, and she'd hugged Lydia stiffly and pressed a wrapped parcel of biscuits into her hands and said, "Take care of yourself," in a voice that meant, "I'm sorry, and I won't say it." Tobias had stayed inside. Lydia watched the farmhouse shrink and then disappear behind the rise, and she thought she would feel something, watching the only home she'd ever had drop out of sight. But she felt mostly cold and a kind of grim curiosity about whether the man she was being delivered to would be the death of her. Because that was the other thing the town said about Caleb Mercer. They said he was dangerous. They said he'd come back from the war wrong, though nobody could say which war or when, and that he'd married a girl from down in the valley who was too pretty and too gentle for the life he'd dragged her into, and that she'd died, and the child with her, and that something in Mercer had died too and left a meaner thing standing in his boots. They said he'd half killed a man with his hands over a horse trade. They said he didn't come to town but twice a year, and that the pass folk gave his land a wide berth. They said a lot of things, and Lydia had heard all of them, and as the wagon climbed, she found she couldn't tell anymore which one she believed. Ferris drove the team hard up through the foothills, and the country changed as they climbed. The gentle farm valley giving way to rock and scrub pine, and then to true mountain, the road narrowing to a track, and the track narrowing to 2 ruts in the grass. They forded a creek running high and cold with snowmelt. They passed a cabin burned to its chimney stones. Nobody's. No story to it that Lydia could see. By late afternoon, the air had gone thin and sharp and smelled of pine pitch and something else underneath it, something animal, and Ferris said, "Mercer's range starts here," and didn't explain how he knew. It was nearly dark when they came over the last rise, and Lydia saw the ranch for the first time. She had braced herself for grand. The number Tobias had named, the fear in people's voices. She'd half expected a great house, the kind of frontier kingdom rich men built to make themselves believe they'd conquered something. What lay below her in the failing light was the opposite, and it shocked her more than grandeur would have. It was dying. That was the only word for it. A long, low house, well built once, but sagging now. A corner of the porch roof caved in and never repaired. A barn that listed. Fences down in 3 places she could count from the rise, the rails gray and silvered with weather. A garden plot gone entirely to weeds, the dead stalks of last year's corn still standing like a graveyard. There were cattle. She could see them scattered loose across the flats, more than she'd expected, but unbranded looking and ranging where they pleased, with no man and no fence to say otherwise. A windmill turned with a screech you could hear from the rise. The whole place had the look of a thing that had been let go, a thing whose owner had stopped seeing it. And standing in the dooryard, watching them come, was a man. He was big. That was the first thing. Big the way she was big, which was a thing she noticed the way you notice your own reflection in a dark window. Tall, heavy through the chest and shoulders, dark-haired and dark-bearded, dressed in clothes that hadn't been mended in too long. He stood with a rifle held loose in one hand, not aimed, not threatening exactly, just present, the way another man might hold a hat. He watched the wagon come down the track, and he didn't move and he didn't call out. and Lydia felt the cold curiosity in her chest curdle into something sharper. Ferris pulled the team up 20 feet off and didn't get down. Broader, Ferris said. The man, Caleb Mercer, it had to be, looked at Lydia. It was not a look she had words for. It wasn't the up-and-down measuring look the suitors had given her, weighing her like livestock. It wasn't unkind. It was, she thought later, the look of a man who had been alone so long that the arrival of another human being registered as a kind of weather. Something that had happened to him, that he had no say in, that he would have to endure. "You can read?" he said. His voice was low and rough, like it didn't get used much. It wasn't the question she'd expected. "Yes." "Cook?" "Yes." "You're not afraid of work?" "No." She held his gaze. "Are you going to ask me anything that isn't about whether I'm useful?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not a smile, nothing so warm as that, but a flicker, like a fish turning over deep in dark water. Ferris made a small sound that might have been a cough or a laugh. "No," Mercer said. "I'm not." He nodded at the carpet bags. "Get your things. Ferris, you'll want to make the creek before full dark." And that was it. That was the whole of her welcome. Lydia climbed down stiff from the long ride and hauled her 2 bags out of the wagon bed, and Ferris turned the team without a word of goodbye and rattled back up the track into the gathering dark. And Lydia Hartwell stood in the ruined dooryard of a stranger's dying ranch, 20 miles from the nearest town, with everything she owned in 2 bags at her feet, and waited to find out what she had been sold into. Mercer had already turned and gone toward the house. "There's a room," he said over his shoulder. "End of the hall. Woods by the stove. I eat at first light, and I don't wait." He stopped at the door, and for a moment she thought he'd say something more, something human, welcome or you'll be all right, or even just good night. Instead, he said, "Don't go in the room across from yours," and went inside and shut the door behind him, leaving her standing in the dark. The room at the end of the hall was small and clean, in the way that meant nobody had used it in a long time. And nobody had thought about it either. A cot, a chair, a washstand with a cracked basin, a window that looked out on the black shape of the mountains. Lydia set down her bags and sat on the edge of the cot and listened to the house. It creaked and settled around her. Somewhere a clock she couldn't see ticked. She did not hear Mercer at all, and that was somehow worse than hearing him, the not knowing where in that dark house he was, or what he was. She did not sleep much. She lay in her clothes on top of the blankets with the carpet bags pulled close, the way she had as a child when she'd been afraid of the dark. And she listened, and at some point near morning she did sleep, and dreamed of nothing, and woke to gray light and the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe somewhere outside, splitting wood with a steady, patient rhythm. She got up. She found the kitchen by following the coffee smell, and she stood in the doorway and looked at it, and her heart sank further than it had sunk yet. It was a wreck, not dirty, that she could have understood. A man alone, a man grieving. It was worse than dirty. It was a kitchen that had been used the way an animal uses a den, the bare minimum, everything else allowed to fall to ruin. A stack of dishes gone furred with old food. A larder near empty. Some flour, some salt pork going green at the edges, a sack of beans, coffee, not much else. The stove cold now, though someone had clearly used it to boil the coffee that sat in a battered pot. Mouse droppings along the baseboards. A window so grimed with smoke and grease that the morning light came through it brown. This, she understood suddenly, was the whole of it. This was what she'd been brought for. Not a wife. He'd made that plain enough, and the town had made it plainer. A worker. A hired girl to claw this place back from the ruin it was sliding into. Because a man who'd let his fences fall and his garden die had let his kitchen die too. And somewhere in the wreckage of whatever had happened to him, he'd had a single practical thought. I need someone to keep me alive. Lydia stood in the doorway for a long moment. And then she did the thing she always did. The thing that was perhaps the truest thing about her. The thing the suitors had hated and the town had mocked and her brother had been glad enough to sell. She rolled up her sleeves. By the time Caleb Mercer came in from splitting wood, she had the stove lit and the worst of the dishes scraped and a pot of the beans soaking, and she was up to her elbows in the grime of the dry sink. And she didn't turn around when she heard him stop in the doorway. "Coffee's no good," she said. "It's been boiled twice and it tastes like the bottom of a boot. I'll make fresh when I'm done here. Where do you keep your eggs?" A long silence. "No hens." Mercer said. She did turn around then. No hens. Foxes got the last of them, 2 winters back. He said it like he was reporting on someone else's life. You've got a hen house standing empty for 2 winters, and you've been buying eggs at the pass for a man's ransom, if you've been eating eggs at all, which by the look of your larder you haven't. She wiped her hands on the rag tucked at her waist. We'll need hens, and lime for that garden, and seed, and you've got fence rail rotting on the ground that ought to be back up before you lose more of those cattle to the high draws. Whose cattle are those anyway? Half of them aren't branded. Mercer looked at her. He'd taken his hat off, and his dark hair was matted with sweat, and there was sawdust on his shoulders. And up close in the morning light, he was younger than she'd thought the night before. Not yet 40, she'd have guessed, though something in his face was older than that, something worn down to the bone. He had a scar through one eyebrow, and his knuckles were scarred too, and his eyes were a gray so pale they were almost colorless, and they were fixed on her now with an expression she still couldn't read. You always talk this much? He said. I always say what wants saying. People generally don't like it. She turned back to the sink. You'll get used to it, or you'll send me back, and seeing as you paid my brother good money for the privilege, I expect you'll get used to it. Eggs, hens, lime, seed, fence. In that order or some other, I don't much care, but those cattle are the only thing on this whole ranch that look like they could fetch $1, and you're losing them a head at a time to the wolves and the weather. Now, do you want me to keep this place alive, or do you want it to fall down around your ears? Because I can do the first and I won't bother with the second. She didn't expect an answer. She'd half expected him to throw her out, and she'd decided in the night that she didn't much care if he did. She'd walk the 20 miles back, she'd sleep in a ditch, she'd do anything before she'd shrink herself small for one more man who looked at her like a problem. Mercer was quiet for a long time. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the windmill screeched. Hens, he said finally. We'll go to the pass Saturday. Make a list. And he put his hat back on and went out, and Lydia stood at the sink with her hands gone still in the gray water, and didn't know whether she'd won something or lost something, or whether, in a place like this, with a man like that, the two were even different things. The work nearly killed her. She would not have admitted it to anyone, least of all to Mercer. But in the first weeks, Lydia Hartwell worked harder than she had ever worked in her life, harder than the farm had ever asked of her, and the farm had asked plenty. She was up before light. She made the fire and the coffee and a real breakfast. Mercer ate like a man who'd forgotten food was a thing you could enjoy, fast and silent, but he ate it all, and once she caught him going back to the stove for a second helping of the cornbread when he thought she'd stepped out, and she said nothing, and felt a small, fierce satisfaction she examined later and didn't entirely understand. After breakfast, he went out to the cattle and the range work, and she stayed and fought the house. She scrubbed the kitchen down to the wood. She washed the brown grime off every window until the light came in clean. She aired the rooms and beat the rugs and found, in the process, the small evidences of a life that had stopped, a woman's shawl folded in a chest, a child's carved horse with one leg broken off, a dress hung in a wardrobe in a room she did not enter because Mercer had told her not to, and because she didn't need telling to know whose room it was. Don't go in the room across from yours. She didn't, but she knew. She'd have known even without the town's gossip, even without the shawl and the broken horse. The whole ranch was a held breath. The whole ranch was a man who had stopped, mid-stride, the day his life ended, and never moved again. He didn't talk. She'd say her piece at meals, about the hens, about the garden coming in, about the cracked harness she'd found and mended, about anything. And he'd listen, or seem to, and grunt, and that was the whole of their conversation most days. He wasn't cruel. That surprised her, given everything the town had said. He never raised his voice to her, never raised a hand, never so much as looked at her in the way men had looked at her all her life. But he was gone, somehow, behind those pale eyes, walled up so deep inside himself that talking to him was like talking down a well, and the cold of it, the relentless distance of it, wore on her worse than cruelty might have. Cruelty she knew how to fight. This she didn't. The hens helped. They went to the pass that first Saturday, a long jolting wagon ride, Mercer silent at the reins. And Lydia bought a dozen laying hens and a mean old rooster and lime and seed and a list of things that made the storekeeper raise his eyebrows at Mercer, and then, when Mercer looked back at him flat and cold, lower them quick. The pass was a one-street town, and the people on the street watched Mercer the way you'd watch a bull loose in a paddock, giving him room. And Lydia saw how it was for him then, saw that the fear the town had taught her was a real thing. He carried everywhere, and she found, to her own surprise, that it made her angry on his behalf. This thick wall of dread that people put up around a grieving man. On the way back, with the hens clucking in their crate and the wagon loaded, she said it. She hadn't planned to. "They're scared of you." Mercer didn't answer for a while. Then, "Good. Is it?" He looked at her sidelong. "Easier. For who?" He didn't answer that one, and she let it go, but she thought about it the whole way home. The word easier, the way a man might build a fence of his own meanness around himself and call it a kindness because it kept the world from getting in to where the soft hurt parts were. She knew something about that. She'd built her own fences. Hers were made of the true sharp things she said, the way she got her word in first and hard so nobody could land theirs on her. They weren't so different, she thought. Him and her. Two big people the world had decided were too much, walled up behind the things that protected them. She didn't say that to him. There were limits. The hens settled in. The garden, limed and seeded and weeded within an inch of its life, began to come up. First the radishes, then the beans, then the corn pushing green out of the turned earth, and Lydia would stand at the new clean kitchen window in the evenings and look at it and feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a kind of root taking hold. She got the porch roof propped, hammering at it herself when she got tired of looking at the caved-in corner, and Mercer came out and watched her struggle with a beam too heavy for one person, and then, without a word, came up and took the other end. And they set it together, and when it was done he looked at it and looked at her and said, "Huh," which was, she was coming to understand, as close as Caleb Mercer came to praise. The cattle were the puzzle. She'd been right about them. There were near 200 head ranging loose across his land, more than enough to make a man comfortable if they'd been gathered and branded and driven to market, and Mercer did none of it. He rode out among them every day. He doctored the sick ones and pulled the bogged ones out of the spring mud and shot the wolves that came down out of the high country, and he did it all with the grim, ceaseless attention of a man performing a duty, and not once did Lydia see him do the obvious thing, the prosperous thing, the thing that would have lifted the ranch out of its slow dying. She asked him about it once, and he went so still and so cold that she didn't ask again. There was a story there. There was a story under everything on that ranch, and she was beginning to understand that she'd have to wait for him to tell it, if he ever did, and that pushing would only drive him deeper down the well. So she waited. She wasn't a patient woman by nature. Patience was one more thing the world had never let her practice, always too busy surviving. But she learned it that spring on Mercer's ranch, watering the garden in the long blue evenings and listening to the hens settle and the windmill turn and the man in the house move from room to room like a ghost in his own life. She learned to wait. She learned the shape of his silences. She learned that he didn't sleep. She'd hear him sometimes in the deep of the night, the floorboards, the screen door, his boots in the yard, walking, always walking, like a man trying to outpace something that lived inside him and couldn't be outpaced. And one night, 6 weeks in, she heard him stop outside her door. She lay still. The boards creaked once, the way they creaked under his weight. He stood there. She could hear him breathing on the other side of the thin door, and she went cold and then hot, every story the town had told her rushing up at once, the temper, the half-killed man, the dead wife, and her hand found the heavy candlestick on the chair beside the cot and closed around it. But he didn't try the door. He just stood there. And then, low, so low she almost missed it, so low she was never entirely sure afterward she'd heard it at all. He spoke, not to her, she didn't think, or not only to her, but to the dark, to the house, to whatever it was that walked him through his nights. "You did good with the garden," Caleb Mercer said. And then the boards creaked again, and his steps went away down the hall and out into the yard, and Lydia lay in the dark with the candlestick in her fist and her heart going hard, and she did not know why her eyes had filled, why those 5 plain words from a half-broken stranger had reached down past every fence she'd built in 28 years of being told she was too much, and touched the soft hurt place at the center of her that no suitor had ever bothered to find. She set the candlestick down. She lay awake a long time, and out in the yard the man walked, back and forth, under the cold mountain stars, and somewhere far up in the high country a wolf was calling, and the windmill turned and turned, and the ruined ranch that too much people were slowly hauling back from the dead settled and creaked around them both in the dark. Lydia had been on the ranch a little over 2 months when she found the graves. She wasn't looking for them. She'd taken to walking the property in the early evenings, partly to learn it and partly because the house got close around her with Mercer's silence in it. And on this particular evening, she'd gone further than usual, up a low rise behind the barn where a stand of aspen grew, their leaves just gone to full green and shivering in the wind that never quite stopped up there. And in among the aspens, in a small clearing somebody had cleared and tended, she found 2 stones. They were good stones. That was what struck her first. Everything else on the ranch had been let go to ruin. The fences, the house, the garden. But these 2 stones had been cut and lettered with care, and the little clearing around them had been kept, the grass cut back, a few wild roses someone had transplanted, and that grew now in a tangle against the bigger stone. Somebody had let his whole life fall down around him and had kept this one small place perfect. The bigger stone said Sarah Mercer, beloved wife, and the dates, and she'd been 24. The smaller stone said Annie, just Annie, and a single set of dates close together, and the child had been 4 years old. Lydia stood among the aspens with the wind moving the leaves and the long light coming gold and slantwise across the mountains, and she understood, finally and completely, the man she'd been sold to. Not the town's monster, not the half-broken hired girl-keeper, a man who'd had a wife and a little girl, a man who'd had a whole life green and growing the way her garden was growing now, and who'd lost it all at once somehow, 4 years and 24 years old in the same close set of dates, and who had not died with them only because the body is stubborn and goes on whether the soul wants it to or not. A man who had let everything fall except the one place that held what he'd lost. She didn't hear him come up behind her. She'd have sworn she'd have heard him, that she knew his step by now. But grief makes a man quiet, and when she turned, he was there at the edge of the clearing, hat in his hand, his pale eyes on the 2 stones, and his face was open, for the first time since she'd come, the wall down, and what was behind it was so much worse than anger that Lydia's breath caught. "I'll go," she said quickly. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "Fever," Mercer said. She went still. "Came up through the valley in the fall, 4 years back." He didn't look at her. He looked at the stones. "Took Annie first, 3 days. Sarah nursed her the whole time, and then she—" His voice didn't break. It just stopped, the way a road stops at a washed-out bridge, and then went on, flatter. "Took Sarah the week after. I rode for the doctor at the pass, and the doctor was 3 towns over with the same fever in his own people, and by the time I got back—" He stopped again. "I dug them myself," he said. "Took me 2 days. Ground was already going hard with the cold. I dug them myself, and I put them up here where Sarah liked to walk, and I sat up here that whole winter, near about. Cattle could have died for all I cared. Place could have fallen down. I wanted it to fall down. Some part of me's been trying to let it fall down ever since." He turned his hat in his big, scarred hands. "Then your brother's letter came, wanting to know would I take a worker. And I figured—" He shook his head. "I don't know what I figured, that it didn't matter, that nothing did. That you'd be one more thing failing slow up here with the rest of it." Lydia stood very still. The wind moved the aspen leaves. A long way off, the windmill turned. "And instead you cleaned the windows," Mercer said. "That was all. That was the whole of it. Instead you cleaned the windows." But there was something in the way he said it. Something cracked and raw and astonished. The wonder of a man who'd been so long in the dark, he'd forgotten light was a thing that could come back, that went through Lydia like a blade, and she found she couldn't speak. And they stood there together in the gold evening light among the dead with the living wind moving all around them. "I'm not her," Lydia said finally. She didn't know why she said it. It came up out of the same true place all her sharp words came from, but it wasn't sharp. It was only true. "I won't ever be her. I'm not pretty, and I'm not gentle, and I'm too much woman to carry through life. Ask anyone in my town, they'll tell you. I came up here because my brother sold me, and I had nowhere else to go, and I figured you'd work me to death. Or worse, that's what they said about you. The things they said—" She stopped, breathing hard. "But I cleaned the windows because I can't help it. Because it's the only thing I've got. The working. It's the only thing nobody ever took off me. They took everything else, but they couldn't take that I'm good at this. that I can make a dead place live. So that's what I did. I wasn't doing it for you. I know, Mercer said. I was doing it because I had to. I know. And then he did the strangest thing, the thing she turned over in her mind for nights afterward. He put his hat back on, and he looked one last time at the two stones, the wife and the little girl in the kept clearing among the aspens, and then he looked at Lydia Hartwell, really looked at her, the way no man in her whole life had ever looked at her, not measuring, not weighing, not finding her too much or too plain or too anything, just seeing her, all of her, the size and the temper and the scarred working hands and the true sharp tongue, seeing the whole of her and not flinching from it. And something happened in his ruined face that she realized, with a shock that went all the way down, was the beginning of a smile. "Supper ready?" he said. And Lydia Hartwell, who had been laughed at and rejected and sold, who had walled herself up behind her own sharp edges so long she'd forgotten there was anything soft left to wall, who had ridden up into these mountains believing she was being thrown away, laughed. It came up out of her belly, that laugh the suitors had hated, big and helpless and real, the first true laugh she'd laughed in longer than she could remember. And it rang out over the clearing and the stones and the green shivering aspens and startled a jay up out of the trees, and Mercer's not-quite smile cracked a little wider at the sound of it. "Beans," she said, when she could talk. "Beans and cornbread, same as every night. You'll eat it and you'll like it." "I expect I will," Caleb Mercer said. And they walked back down the rise together toward the house with the dark coming on, the big quiet man and the big sharp woman, two people the world had thrown away, down toward the lit kitchen window that she had scrubbed clean with her own hands so the light could get out. And behind them, up among the aspens, the wild roses someone had planted long ago moved in the wind over the two stones, and the mountains went blue and then black against a sky just pricking through with the first hard stars. Neither of them knew yet what was coming up the road from the valley. Neither of them knew that the past Lydia had ridden away from was not finished with her, that her brother would come again and not alone, and that everything they were building in the quiet up here would soon be put to a test that would crack one of them clean open. They only knew that one evening among the aspens that they were not as alone as they had been, and for two people who had each made an art of being alone, that was a stranger and more frightening thing than any of the troubles still to come. Lydia made the beans. Mercer ate them all, and a second helping besides, and didn't pretend he hadn't, and when she cleared his plate, his scarred hand brushed hers for half a moment on the table, and neither of them said a word about it, and neither of them moved away. The brush of his hand became, over the weeks that followed, a thing neither of them spoke of, and both of them remembered. Lydia noticed it changed nothing on the surface. Mercer still ate fast and talked little, still walked the yard at night when sleep wouldn't take him, still rode out among the cattle at dawn with that grim, ceaseless attention that was the only kind of tending he seemed to know. But something underneath had shifted, the way the ground shifts in the spring when the frost goes out of it, invisible at the top and everything moving down below. He started talking. Not much, not all at once, but where before he'd grunted at her supper table reports, now he'd sometimes answer, and once or twice he asked her a question, and the first time he did it, she was so surprised she dropped the spoon. "How'd you learn to mend harness?" he said. They were eating. The window behind him was full of the last green light. "My father." She picked the spoon back up. "He had bad lungs the last years, couldn't do the clothes work. His hands shook. So I did it. Harness, the plow traces, the boots. Anything wanted mending, I mended it. Wasn't anybody else to. Your brother." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Toby's good with a thing while it's whole. It's the broken things he can't abide. Soon as something breaks, he wants it gone, out of his sight. Person or harness, all the same to him." She heard what she'd said and looked down at her plate. "I expect that's why he sold me. I'd gone and got broken on him. 3 men saying no to a woman, that's a broke thing in a small town. Easier to be shut of it than to look at it every day across the table." Mercer was quiet a moment. "He's a fool then." It was the closest thing to a kind word he'd said to her, and it landed harder than kindness should have because she wasn't used to it, because she'd spent 28 years learning to deflect cruelty and had built nothing at all to catch the other thing when it came. She covered it the way she covered everything, with work, getting up to fetch the coffee. But he saw, she thought. He saw, and he let her cover it, and that was its own kind of gentleness, the kind that doesn't make you pay for being soft in front of it. The summer came on hot and dry. The garden flourished under her hands. She put up beans and pickled what she could, and the corn came tall, and the hens gave more eggs than two people could eat, so she started taking the extra to the pass on Saturdays and trading for the things they couldn't grow. She drove the wagon herself now. Mercer had taught her the team, standing close behind her with his big hands over hers on the lines the first time, and she'd been so aware of him there, the heat of him, the smell of horse and sweat and wood smoke that was just him now and not something to fear, that she'd nearly run the wagon into the gatepost, and he'd said, "Easy," in that low, rough voice, and she hadn't known if he meant the horses. In the past, they watched her the way they watched him now. The storekeeper's wife, a thin woman named Della Pruitt, with a mouth like a coin purse, took to following Lydia through the store with her eyes, and one Saturday she couldn't hold it any longer. "You're the Hartwell girl," Della said, "from down the valley. The one that—" She stopped herself, but the rest of it hung in the air, the one that nobody would marry, and Lydia felt the old heat come up her neck. "I'm Lydia Hartwell, yes. And you're keeping house. For him." Della's eyes went bright with the particular pleasure some women take in another's expected ruin. "All the way up there. Alone, the two of you. I keep his house, and his hens, and his garden, and his books," Lydia said. "And I sleep in a room at the end of the hall behind a door that locks. Not that it's your business, Mrs. Pruitt, and not that you'd believe me either way, so I'll save us both the trouble." She set her egg money on the counter. "I'll take the salt and the coffee and the bolt of blue calico, and you can tell the whole pass whatever you like, because I've heard worse from better, and it never once put food on my table or kept the cold out." Della Pruitt's mouth opened and shut. Behind her, the storekeeper turned away to hide his face, and Lydia thought she heard him cough that was a laugh, the same one old Ferris had coughed the night she came. She gathered her goods and walked out with her chin up the way she'd walked out of Pell's the day Harlan ruined her, except this time there was no shaking afterward, no woodshed, no bleeding palms. This time she climbed up onto Mercer's wagon and took up Mercer's team and drove back up toward Mercer's mountains. And somewhere on the road home she realized she'd stopped thinking of them as his. She didn't tell him about Della Pruitt. But he could read her, she was learning, better than a man that quiet had any right to, and that night at supper he said, "Somebody at the pass say something. They always say something." What'd they say? That a woman keeping a man's house alone is a scandal. She buttered her cornbread harder than it needed. Same thing they'd say anywhere. I told her where she could put it. Mercer set down his fork. He looked at her a long moment with those pale gray eyes, and then he said, slow, like the words came up from somewhere deep and unused, "It bother you, what they say." It used to. She thought about it, honestly, the way she tried to do everything. It used to be the whole world what they said. Felt like I was made out of it. Then I came up here and there wasn't anybody to say anything, just you and the hens don't have opinions on my face or my size, or who'll have me. A corner of her mouth went up. And you never said a word about any of it. First man I ever met didn't. So I expect I got out of the habit of caring. It comes back, down at the pass, with women like that one, but it goes away again on the ride home. She looked at him across the table, across the lamplight. It always goes away by the time I get home. She watched him take in the word home, watched it land on him, and for a moment she was afraid she'd said too much, pushed too far, the way she always pushed too far. But Mercer didn't wall up. He held her eyes, and something worked in his jaw, and finally he said, "Sarah used to say I let the past folk make me into something I wasn't, the temper, the fights." He turned his coffee cup slow on the table. "Wasn't always like this. Wasn't always—" He gestured vaguely at himself, at the silence, at the years. "I had a laugh once, too. She said it was my best thing." His mouth twisted, not a smile. Buried it up the rise with the rest. It was the most he'd ever said about her, about Sarah, the living Sarah, and not just the stone. And Lydia held very still, the way you hold still when a wild thing comes close and you don't want to spook it back into the brush. "What was she like?" Lydia said softly, and Caleb Mercer told her. Not all of it, not that night, but some. That Sarah had been small and dark and quick to laugh, that she'd come from a town in the south and hated the cold and never once complained of it, that she'd been able to gentle any horse on the place, and that Annie had her hands, her quick, clever hands, even at 4. That Sarah had loved the Aspens, had walked up the rise most evenings to watch the light go off the mountains, which was why he'd put them there. He talked in that flat, halting way, stopping and starting, and Lydia listened and didn't fill the silences and didn't say any of the soft, worthless things people say. And when he finally ran out of words and sat there, hollowed and quiet, she didn't reach across the table to touch his hand, though she wanted to. She just got up and refilled his coffee and set the pot down and said, "She sounds like she was worth the missing." She was. His voice was rough. "I wasn't worth her. That's the truth of it. She married down and everybody knew it, including me. I always figured I'd spend my whole life trying to be worth her, and I never—" He stopped. "Then there wasn't time left to." "That's not how it works," Lydia said. "Being worth somebody. It's not a sum you pay down over years till you've earned them. My mother used to say love's not a ledger. You don't get to the bottom of the column and find out if you came out ahead." She paused. "Of course, my mother also stayed with my father through 40 years of him never once thanking her for a single thing, so maybe she wasn't the one to ask." And Mercer laughed. It came out of him cracked and rusty, a sound that clearly surprised him as much as it surprised her, short and rough and gone almost before it started. But it was a laugh, a true one, the first she'd heard from him, and his hand came up to his own mouth like he could push it back in, like he'd let something out that he wasn't supposed to. They looked at each other across the lamplit table, both startled, and the moment stretched, and Lydia felt something open in her chest that was so much like hope it frightened her, because hope was the thing that had cost her most, every time, all her life. "There it is," she said quietly. "Your best thing. Wasn't buried so deep after all." He didn't answer. He couldn't, maybe. But he didn't look away either, and that was answer enough. The trouble, when it came on a Tuesday in the deep of summer, and it didn't come up the road as Lydia had half feared it would. It came down out of the high country in the form of weather, the way the worst things on a mountain do. The cattle had drifted high, up into the draws after the green grass, the way they did every summer, and Mercer rode up after them on a morning that started clear and turned, by noon, into something Lydia had never seen. A wall of black cloud coming over the peaks fast as a running horse, and a wind that flattened the garden, and then hail in July, white stones the size of musket balls, hammering the roof, and stripping the corn she'd nursed all summer to green rags in the space of 10 minutes. She stood at the kitchen window with her heart in her throat, watching her garden destroyed and not caring about the garden at all, because Mercer was up in the high draws where the lightning was, and the lightning was coming down on those peaks like the sky had a grudge against the rock. He didn't come back by dark. She lit the lamp and put it in the window. She kept the supper warm, and then she gave up keeping it warm. She walked the yard in the wet with a shawl over her head and called his name into the dark, and the wind took it. She thought about the things the town had never said, the things that were true instead of cruel. That a man alone in mountain country is one bad step from dead all the time. That horses bolt in lightning and break legs in gopher holes and roll on the men who ride them. That the cold up high could kill in summer if you were hurt and couldn't move. She thought about him out there. She thought about the lit window she'd put the lamp in so the light could get out. And she thought, standing in the wet black yard, that she had gone and done the worst thing, the thing she'd sworn off after Harlan, after all of them. She'd let somebody matter. She'd let a man matter. And now he was out in the dark and might not come back. And she'd have to find out whether she could survive that, on top of everything else she'd survived. He came back near midnight. She heard the horse first, the wrong rhythm of it, 3 beats instead of 4, and she was out the door and across the yard before she'd thought to grab the lamp. Mercer was half off the saddle, slumped, one leg dark and wrong, and the horse was favoring a foreleg and blowing hard, and Lydia got her shoulder under him as he came down and took his whole weight, all of it, the size of him that would have buckled a smaller woman, and held him up. Horse went down, he got out, in the wash, caught my leg under. His breath hissed. Not broke, I don't think. Walked the horse most of the way. He's lamed. Don't talk! She was already moving, hauling him toward the house, his arm over her shoulders, her arm hard around his back. Lean on me. I've got you. I've got you, Caleb. Lean. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She felt him go still against her, just for a step, and then he leaned. He let her take his weight. This man who had carried everything alone for 4 years let himself be carried, and they went into the house that way, together, and she got him into the chair by the stove and went to work. The leg wasn't broken. Bruised black to the bone, swelling fast, the skin split where the saddle had ground into it, but the bone held when she felt along it with her father's daughter hands, and she cleaned the wound and bound it and got his boots off and his wet clothes off down to what decency allowed and a blanket around him. And she fed the fire up high and made him drink coffee laced with the whiskey she'd found in the larder and never seen him touch. And the whole time he watched her work over him with an expression she'd seen only once before, up among the aspens, the wall down, the raw thing behind it showing through. "You were going to come after me," he said. His voice was thick. The whiskey, the cold, the pain. "If I hadn't come back. You were going to go up there in the dark." "Of course I was." "You'd have died." "Maybe." She tied off the bandage. "But I wasn't going to sit in that kitchen and watch the lamp burn down and just let you be gone. I've had enough of letting things be gone. People deciding things are broke and gone and shut of it. I'm done with it. If you'd been up there, I'd have come. And if I'd died, I'd have died doing the one thing I never got to do for anybody, which is not give up on them." She heard her own voice shaking and hated it and kept on anyway. "So don't tell me I'd have died. I know it. I was going to go anyway." Mercer reached out. His hand was cold and it shook a little and it closed around her wrist. Not hard, just holding, and she went still on her knees by the chair with the firelight on both their faces. "Sarah'd have liked you," he said. "She'd have hated you first. 2 women like you in one house, the roof had come off." The ghost of that cracked laugh. "But she'd have liked you, after." "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me," Lydia said. "And I don't know whether to thank you or hit you." "Both," Mercer said. She'd have said both, and they stayed like that a while. His cold hand around her wrist, and the fire popping, and the storm dying away outside to a soft, steady rain. 2 people who'd each long ago decided they were too much and too broken to be carried by anyone. Sitting in the warm with the dark held off, each one having just learned that the other would have gone up the mountain in the lightning rather than let them be lost. He healed slow. The leg kept him off the horse the better part of 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks did more to break down what was left of the wall between them than all the months before, because a proud man laid up independent has nowhere to hide. Lydia did the close range work she could, fed the horse, doctored the lame foreleg, walked out to check the nearest cattle, and Mercer sat on the propped porch and directed her and chafed at his own uselessness, and slowly started to talk, really talk, not just about Sarah and Annie, though that too, but about everything. The war he'd come back from, which had been a real one and a bad one, and which he described in 3 flat sentences that told her more about why he didn't sleep than 3 hours would have. The ranch, how he'd built it from nothing, the dream of it, why he didn't gather the cattle. That last one he came to sideways, the way he came to all the hard things. "You keep asking about the cattle," he said. They were on the porch in the evening. His leg was up on a crate. "Why I don't gather and drive them?" "I stopped asking. You don't like it." "There's a man," Mercer said, "down in the valley. Big rancher, owns near everything south of the pass and most of the men in it besides." Lassiter. He said the name like it tasted bad. "When Sarah died, when I was up on that rise, that whole winter not caring did I live or die, Lassiter came up here, smiling. Real sorry for my loss. And he offered to buy the place. Cattle, land, all of it, for about 1/10 of what it's worth, because he figured I was broke enough to take it. And when I told him no, he told me he could wait, that a man falling apart's just a matter of time, that he'd be here to pick it up cheap when I finally went under." Mercer's jaw worked. "So I don't gather the cattle. I don't drive them to market, because the day I start making this place pay is the day Lassiter knows I'm coming back. And he's got men at the pass. He's got the say-so over the only market in 100 miles. And he'd find a way to break a drive of mine just to prove he can. Easier to let it sit. Let him think I'm still going under." His mouth twisted. "I've been letting him think it so long I half forgot it was a strategy and not just the truth." Lydia sat with that. "So he's waiting for you to fail. He's waiting for me to fail. And every day you don't gather those cattle, you're failing on purpose, to keep him from knowing you could win." She shook her head slow. "That's the saddest thing I ever heard, Caleb Mercer. You've been beating a man by losing for 4 years. Didn't have anything to win for, he said. Till, and he stopped and didn't finish it and looked out at the dark mountains. And Lydia didn't make him finish it because she heard the end of the sentence anyway, hanging there in the soft summer dark, plain as if he'd said it. And it sat warm and terrifying in her chest the rest of that night and into her dreams. She didn't know, she couldn't have known, that even as Mercer told her about Lassiter on the porch that evening, down in the valley a letter was already written and sealed. That her brother Tobias, his debts come due again and worse, had gone looking for the easiest money a man like him could find. That he'd found his way to Lassiter's big house, and that the two of them had sat at Lassiter's long table and worked out an arrangement that suited them both. The rancher who wanted Mercer's land and had been told there was a Hartwell woman keeping his house now, and the brother who'd already sold his sister once and saw no reason a thing that had sold once couldn't be sold again for more, to a man with deeper pockets and a longer memory for grudges. But that was still down in the valley, still sealed in a letter, still a day's ride and a turning of the season away. Up on the mountain there was only the porch, and the dark, and the leg healing slow, and the two of them learning, clumsy and late and afraid, how to be carried. Mercer's hand found hers in the dark between their chairs, and this time it didn't brush and move away. It stayed. And Lydia turned her own hand over under his so their palms met, two big scarred working hands that the world had decided were too rough and too much, fitted together in the dark, holding on. While up the rise the wild roses moved over the stones and the wind came down off the cold peaks and the windmill turned and turned and turned. They came on a clear, bright morning at the tail end of summer when the aspens up the rise had just started to turn at their tops, and Lydia saw the dust first. She was in the garden, salvaging what the hail had left and what had grown back after, and she straightened with a basket on her hip and saw it. A plume of dust rising on the valley track, more than one rider, a wagon by the breadth of it, coming up steady toward the ranch. Her stomach dropped before her mind had caught up, the body knowing trouble before the head did, the way it always had. She called for Mercer, who was at the corral with the four-leg-lamed horse, walking now without the limp but slow, and he came around the barn and stood beside her and shaded his eyes against the morning. "Who is it?" she said. "Don't know yet." But his voice had changed. He'd seen the wagon too. "Go in the house." "I will not." "Lydia." He looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen there. Not the grief, not the closed-off cold, but a kind of bracing, a man squaring up. "I don't know what's coming up that road. Go in the house till I do." "Whatever's coming up that road," she said, "is coming for one of us, and I expect it's me by the size of it. So I'll stand right here and meet it, the same as you would." She set the basket down. "I'm done being put in houses while men decide things about me on the porch. If it's my trouble, I'll stand in it." He looked at her a long moment. Then he gave a short nod, the kind of nod that conceded she was right and that he'd known she would be, and he went into the house, and Lydia thought for one cold second that he'd gone to leave her to it. But he came back out with the rifle, and he didn't aim it, just held it the way he'd held it the first night she came, loose in one hand, present. And he stood beside her in the dooryard, and they watched the dust come down to riders, and the riders come down to faces, and one of the faces was her brother's. Tobias rode in the lead, sitting his horse stiff and proud in a coat she'd never seen. A good coat. A coat bought with money he hadn't had the last time she saw him. Behind him came the wagon, driven by a hired man, and beside the wagon rode a heavy older man on a tall gray horse, a man dressed rich and easy, a man who rode up into another man's yard like he already owned the ground under it. Lydia knew who he was before Mercer said it. She felt Mercer go hard and still beside her, felt the change in him the way you feel cold come off a window, and he said one word, low, "Lassiter." And behind Lassiter, hanging back a little, smiling a smile she would have known in her sleep, the smile that had ruined her outside Pell's Mercantile in front of the whole town, Harlan Voss. The riders pulled up. For a moment nobody said anything. The hens fussed somewhere behind the barn. Tobias wouldn't quite look at her, his eyes going everywhere but her face, and that told her more than anything that whatever this was, it was bad, and that he knew it was bad, and that he'd come anyway. "Toby," Lydia said, "you're a long way up." "Lydia," he cleared his throat, you look well." "I look like a woman who works, which is what you sold me to do." She kept her voice level. Who are these men in my dooryard? Lassiter answered before her brother could. He swung down off the gray horse, easy for a heavy man, and stood there brushing the dust off his fine coat, and he smiled at her, a smile with nothing behind it but appetite. Miss Hartwell, a pleasure. Your brothers told me a great deal. His eyes moved over her, the old up-and-down measuring look, and then past her to the ranch, the propped porch, the cleaned windows, the garden, the mended fence. Taking inventory, she realized, of the work she'd done, the place she'd hauled back from the dead. And I must say, he undersold you. This place was a ruin a year ago. Now look at it. You've a gift, Miss Hartwell, a real gift for making a dead thing pay. Say what you came to say, Lassiter. Mercer's voice was flat and cold as river stone. And then get off my ground. Lassiter turned to him, unhurried, the way a man turns to a dog that's barked. Mercer, you're looking better than the last time I saw you. There's color in you. A man wouldn't think it, the state you were in. He smiled. Amazing what a good woman'll do for a place. And for a man. He let that sit. Which is why I've come. I've a proposition, and it's a generous one, more generous than you deserve given how you've nursed that grudge of yours all these years. I've got no business with you. You've got the business I make for you, Lassiter said, pleasant as ever, which is the only kind there is in this valley, as you well know. But I'm not here for your land today, Mercer. Not directly. He turned back to Lydia, and his smile widened, and she felt the trap closing before she could see the shape of it. I'm here for the woman. The dooryard went very quiet. Her brother, Lassiter went on, holds her contract. The arrangement he made with you was for her labor. A year, was it? A simple work agreement, no different than any hired hand, terminable by the party that holds it. He drew a folded paper from inside his fine coat. And the party that holds it is her family, her blood. Mr. Hartwell here, who has agreed for a consideration we've settled between us to transfer that arrangement to me. A new contract, longer term, 5 years, renewable. To run my household down in the valley, which is considerably grander than this, and which could use a woman with her gift for setting a place to rights. He held the paper out, not to her, to Tobias, the way you'd pass a deed. It's all legal, Miss Hartwell, signed and witnessed. Your brother's debts are cleared and you've a position in the finest house south of the pass. You should be thanking him. Lydia couldn't speak. She stood there in the dooryard with the morning sun on her and felt the years fall away. All the years of being a thing that got passed and traded and decided about, a thing with no say in where it went or who held the paper, and she looked at her brother, and her brother looked at the ground. You sold me again, she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Toby, you already sold me once, and you went and did it again. It's a better place, Liddy. He used the old name, the child name, and it was worse than if he'd cursed her. It's a real position, in a real house, not stuck up here at the end of the world with... He gestured at Mercer, at the ranch, and couldn't finish. Lassiter's a respectable man. You'd have your own room and good wages, and you wouldn't be... People wouldn't talk. The way they talk. About you up here, alone with him. The way they talk. She laughed, and it wasn't her good laugh. It was a sound with broken glass in it. You sold me to fix the talk. You sold me the first time to fix your debts, and you're selling me the second time to fix the talk. And the talk's the talk you let happen, Toby. You and the whole rotten valley that decided I was a thing to laugh at. 3 men saying no. The Hartwell girl, nobody'd carry. That's the very thing, said Harlan Voss. He'd been quiet till then, hanging back on his horse with that smile. And now he walked the horse forward a few steps, into the thick of it, and Lydia's whole body went cold at the sound of his voice. The voice that had said the thing outside the mercantile. The voice she still sometimes heard in the bad part of the night. That's the very thing, Lydia, Harlan said, easy, conversational, like they were old friends meeting at market. Nobody'd carry you. I told you so myself, didn't I? And I was right, wasn't I? 3 of us said no, and look where you ended up. A hired girl for a madman in the hills. He grinned around at the others, inviting them to enjoy it, the way he'd invited Dewey Crane to enjoy it that day. I'll say this, you clean up a place nice. Mr. Lassiter saw the same thing I always saw. You're a workhorse, and there's worse things to be. A man doesn't have to want to marry a thing to want to own it. I told Mr. Lassiter, I said, she's too much woman to carry through life, but she'll work the hide off a hired girl half her size. And you don't pay a draft horse in tenderness. You pay it in oats and a dry stall. That's enough, Mercer said. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd said it quiet, almost soft. But something in the quiet of it stopped the dooryard cold, stopped Harlan's grin halfway off his face. Mercer hadn't moved. He still held the rifle loose at his side. But the air around him had changed, gone dense and dangerous, and Lydia understood for the first time, standing next to it, exactly why the pass folk gave this man a wide berth, why they told the stories they told. It wasn't temper. It was something colder and more certain than temper. It was a man who had nothing left to lose deciding, in real time, exactly how much he was willing to do. You don't get to talk to her, Mercer said. Any of you. You rode up into my yard to sell a woman like she's a heifer, and you stand there and call her a horse to her face, in front of her brother, and you smile while you do it. His pale eyes moved over the three of them, Tobias, Lassiter, Harlan, slow, marking each one. I've stood a lot of things from you, Lassiter. Stood you coming up here the winter my family was fresh in the ground, smiling, wanting to buy the place off a man too broke with grief to know what he was signing. I stood that. I let you think you'd won, all these years, but you misjudged the one thing. He paused. You figured a broke man stays broke. You figured I'd nothing left worth fighting for, so I wouldn't fight. And you're 4 years out of date. Mercer, Lassiter said, and for the first time the easy smile had a crack in it. Don't be a fool. The contract's legal. The man holds his sister's paper. He can transfer it. It's done. You've no standing here. She's not yours. No, Mercer said. She's not mine. She's not anybody's. That's the whole thing you can't get through your head. You and her brother and this grinning piece of work on the horse. She's not a thing that's owned. There's no paper in the world that makes a person property, no matter how many men sign it. He turned then, and he looked at Lydia, and the dangerous cold went out of his face, and something else came into it. Something that cost him. She could see it cost him. Every word of it dragged up out of the place where he'd buried himself for 4 years. And there's no paper that says what I'm about to say either. So I'll just say it plain, and they can hear it, and you can hear it, and then you'll do whatever you decide to do, because that part's yours and nobody else's. Caleb, she said, don't what? She didn't know. Don't do this in front of them. Don't say it where it could be used against him. Don't give these men one more soft thing to break. Lydia Hartwell. He said her whole name like it weighed something. I brought you up here to keep a house. That's the truth, and I won't pretty it up. I figured you'd be one more thing dying slow on this place along with me. And instead you cleaned the windows. You put up the porch. You buried your hands in that dead garden and made it grow, and you walked out into the lightning after me, when any sensible person would have sat tight, and you sat by my chair and bound my leg and called me by my name, and somewhere in all that you went and brought this place back to life, and you brought me back with it, and I didn't even feel it happening till it was already done. His voice was rough, breaking at the edges, a man unused to it. I haven't laughed in 4 years. You made me laugh at my own supper table. I haven't slept a whole night in 4 years, and last week I slept because I knew you were down the hall, and the house wasn't empty anymore. I'm not a good bet, Lydia. I'm broke and I'm hard and I've got a temper and I've got 2 graves up that rise. I'll tend till I die. But I'm asking you, not to work for me, not for anybody to own. I'm asking you to marry me, to stay. Because you're not too much. You were never too much. You're exactly enough. And every man who ever told you different was too small to carry what you are. And that's their failing, not yours. The dooryard was dead silent. Harlan Voss's grin was gone entirely now. Tobias had finally looked up, his mouth open. And Lassiter's face had gone hard and ugly, the appetite curdling into something meaner, a man watching a thing he meant to own walk out of his grasp. This is touching, Lassiter said, but it changes nothing. The contract is, burn the contract, Lydia said. She wasn't looking at Lassiter. She was looking at Mercer, at Caleb, at this big, hard-broken man standing in the dooryard with a rifle in one hand and his whole ruined heart held out in the other. And she felt something break open in her that she'd been holding shut so long she'd forgotten it could open. Not the fences she'd built of sharp words. Something behind the fences. The soft hurt thing at the center that no suitor had ever bothered to find, and that this man had found without even seeming to look. "Burn it," she said again, louder, and now she did turn to Lassiter, to her brother, to Harlan Voss. "There's no contract because there's nothing to contract. You can't transfer me, Toby, because you don't hold me. Nobody holds me. I let you sell me the first time because I was beaten down so low I believed it was all I was worth, a number you could clear in a season. I rode up here believing I was being thrown away." Her voice rang out clear over the dooryard, over the morning, over all of them. "But I wasn't thrown away. I was sent to the one place in the world where somebody finally looked at me and didn't see too much. So you can take your paper, Mr. Lassiter, and you can take your generous offer. And you, Harlan Voss, you can take that smile back down the mountain and tell the whole valley what you saw up here. Tell them the Hartwell girl nobody'd carry got asked to be a wife by a man you're all too scared to look at straight, and tell them she said—" She turned back to Caleb. The morning sun was full on both their faces. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't care. She didn't care who saw. The shaking she'd always done alone in the woodshed was happening right out here in the light, and she let it. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you. Yes." For a moment nobody moved, and then Lassiter's face went from ugly to dangerous, and his hand moved toward his own coat, and Lydia saw it, and her heart stopped. But Mercer had seen it too, had been watching for it the whole time, and the rifle that had hung so loose and harmless at his side came up smooth and fast and steady, leveled square on Lassiter's chest, and the cold, certain thing was back in Caleb Mercer's face, fuller than before. "Don't," Mercer said. "Don't reach. You came up here thinking you'd buy a woman off a coward's brother and ride home before noon. You misjudged every part of it. Now you'll turn that gray horse around, all three of you, and you'll ride back down to the valley, and you'll tell whoever asks that Caleb Mercer's not broke anymore, and his ranch isn't for sale, and his wife—" The word landed in the dooryard like a struck bell. "His wife isn't for sale either. Not now. Not ever. Not for any price you've got in that fat coat. And if you ever come up this road again with a paper or a smile or a single word about what she is or isn't worth, you'll find out exactly how much truth there was in all those stories you told about me. Now go." Lassiter went. He didn't say another word. There was nothing to say to a leveled rifle in the hands of a man with 2 graves up the hill and nothing to lose. And he hauled the gray horse around hard and spurred it back up the track, and his hired man turned the empty wagon after him. Harlan Voss lingered 1 second longer, his face white now, the grin nowhere to be found, and he opened his mouth like he might say one last cruel thing for the road. And Mercer just looked at him, and Harlan shut his mouth and turned his horse and went, fast, not looking back. Only Tobias stayed for a moment, his horse dancing under him, his face a wreck of shame. "Liddy," he started, I thought—" "I know what you thought, Toby." Her voice was steady now, steadier than it had ever been with him. "You thought a broke thing could be sold twice. You were wrong both times. The first time it wasn't broke, and the second time it wasn't yours." She looked at her brother, the last of her blood, and felt the things she'd carried for him all these years, the duty, the keeping his house, the burying their parents while he looked away from anything broken, felt it set itself down at last, gentle, like a basket of eggs onto a table. "Go home to Maggie and the babies. Pay your debts honest from here out, and don't come up this road again unless you're coming to ask after your sister like a brother, and not to sell her like a steer. That door's open to you. The other one's shut for good." Tobias looked at her, and at Mercer with the rifle, and at the ranch his sister had hauled back from the dead, and whatever he meant to say, he didn't say it. He wheeled his horse and rode after the others, down the track, down toward the valley, the dust of all 3 of them rising and then settling, and then gone. And then it was just the 2 of them, the way it had been, the way it would be. Lydia Hartwell and Caleb Mercer, standing in the dooryard of a living ranch in the late summer sun, the rifle lowered now and forgotten, the aspens turning gold up the rise, the hens fussing behind the barn like nothing in the world had happened at all. Caleb lowered the rifle the rest of the way and leaned it against the porch post, and he turned to her, and now that the men were gone and there was nobody left to be hard in front of, the hardness went out of him all at once, and what was left was just a man, big and scarred and shaking a little himself, looking at a woman like he couldn't quite believe she was still standing there. "You meant it," he said. "Yes, you meant it." "I never said a thing in my life I didn't mean," Lydia said. It's been my whole trouble. And she laughed, the good laugh, the belly laugh, the one that had ruined her with 3 men, and that this one fourth man had asked to keep forever. And it rang out over the dooryard and the garden and the gold-tipped aspens, and Caleb Mercer crossed the few feet of ground between them and stood close, closer than he'd ever stood, and lifted one big scarred hand and laid it against the side of her face, careful, like she might break, which made her want to laugh again because she was about the least breakable thing in the territory. And she leaned her cheek into his rough palm and shut her eyes, and for a long moment in the late summer light, neither one of them said anything at all. Because for once there was nothing that wanted saying, and the saying could wait, and the world could go on turning down in its mean little valley. And up here on the mountain, 2 people the world had thrown away stood holding on to each other in the sun. But the saying couldn't wait long, because that was the thing about a man like Caleb Mercer. He could level a rifle at the most powerful man in the valley without his hand shaking, but the moment the danger passed and there was only a woman left standing close with her cheek in his palm, the fear came up in him worse than any rifle could call out. She felt it happen. She felt the hand against her face go stiff, felt him start to draw back into himself the way he had 100 times before, the wall coming up out of long habit, and she opened her eyes and caught his wrist before he could pull away. "No," she said. "Don't do that. Don't you dare do that now." "Lydia." His voice had gone rough and uncertain. "You don't know what you said yes to." "I know exactly what I said yes to. I said yes to a hard, broke, scarred-up rancher with a temper and 2 graves and a habit of walking the yard all night. I've been living with him 3 months. I'm not buying a thing sight unseen, Caleb. I've seen the whole of it." She held his wrist. "What's this all of a sudden? You said it out there in front of Lassiter without blinking, and now there's nobody to be brave for, and you're trying to run." He pulled his hand back, but gently, and turned away from her and walked a few steps into the yard, and stood there with his back to her, looking up the rise toward the aspens, toward the stones. And Lydia understood, the way she'd come to understand his silences. Of course, it was them. It was always going to come back to them. "I made promises before," Caleb said. He didn't turn around. "To Sarah. Standing up in front of people, same as you'd have me do. I promised her a good life, and I gave her a hard one, dragged her up here to the end of the world where the doctor was 3 towns gone when the fever came, and I promised I'd keep her and Annie safe, and I—" His voice stopped at the washed-out bridge again and went on flatter. "I dug their graves with my own hands, Lydia. 2 days in the freezing ground. A man makes a promise, and then he buries it. I don't know that I've got the right to make another one. I don't know that I can stand to." Lydia came up behind him. She didn't touch him. She stood close enough that he'd know she was there. "You think I'm asking you to promise nothing bad'll ever happen?" It wasn't a question. "You think marrying me means swearing the fever won't come again, or the hail, or the next thing, and you can't swear it because you swore it once, and the ground took her anyway." She let that sit between them. "I'm not asking you to promise that. Nobody can promise that. The fever didn't come because you failed her, Caleb. It came because it comes. It comes to good men and bad ones, to careful ones and careless ones, and there wasn't a thing in your 2 hands that could have stopped it, and you've spent 4 years up that rise punishing yourself for not being able to fight off a sickness with a shovel and a prayer." She paused. "I'm not asking you to keep me safe from the world. I grew up in the world. I know what it does. I'm asking you to be in it with me. That's all. That's the only promise I want. Not that nothing will ever take me, just that you won't leave before it does." He turned around then, and his face, the hard man's face, the face the whole valley feared, was wet, openly, a thing she'd have bet good money she'd never see, and he made no move to hide it. "That I can promise," he said. "That one I can keep." "Then that's enough." She reached up and wiped his cheek with her thumb, rough, practical, the same hand that bound his leg and scraped his dishes and pulled the weeds out of the dead garden. "That's plenty. Now come inside before the whole valley rides back up here and finds the both of us bawling in the yard like a pair of weaned calves. There's bacon wants frying, and you didn't eat your breakfast on account of all the marriage proposals and rifle business." And he laughed, the rusty, cracked sound but fuller now, less like it surprised him. And he let her steer him back toward the house, and somewhere in the turning of the morning, the fear had been said out loud and made smaller for the saying, the way the fear always was. They were married 11 days later, but the 11 days were not quiet ones because Caleb Mercer was a different man now, and he knew it, and so did the valley. The morning after Lassiter rode off humiliated, Caleb got up before light, and Lydia found him at the corral saddling the sound horse with a look on him she hadn't seen. Not the grim duty look he wore among the cattle, but something keener, a man with a plan in his head and the will to do it. "Where are you off to?" "To gather cattle," Caleb said. 200 had been ranging this mountain 4 years while I sat on my hands letting Lassiter think I was finished. "Well, I'm finished being finished." He cinched the saddle. "I'm going to bring them down, brand the slicks, sort the market steers, and I'm going to drive them to the railhead at Coldwater before the snow flies." "Coldwater's 80 miles. "It is. Lassiter's market is at the pass, 20 miles. You said yourself he's got the say-so over it, his men, his prices, which is exactly why I'm not selling at the pass." Caleb swung up into the saddle and looked down at her, and there was something almost like the ghost of mischief in his pale eyes, a thing she'd never seen there and that she suspected belonged to the man he'd been before the fever, the one with the laugh. "He's got the pass sewn up." "Fine. Let him have it. There's a railhead at Coldwater built since the last time he bothered checking what his enemies could do, and there's a cattle buyer there pays top dollar and doesn't owe Lassiter a thing. He's been so busy waiting for me to fail close to home, he never reckoned I'd just go around him. 80 miles is 80 miles. A man can drive cattle 80 miles. It's been done." Lydia looked up at her husband-to-be, this man transformed overnight from a ghost walking the yard into a rancher with a drive in his head, and she felt a fierce, ridiculous pride swell in her chest, and right behind it, the worry. "You can't gather and brand and drive 200 head alone." "No," he said, "I can't." And he looked at her and waited. It took her a second, then she laughed. "You want me. I want you. You can ride. You can work harder than any 2 men I've hired, and I've quit hiring because I couldn't stand them. And," his voice roughened, "I find I don't much want to do it without you, any of it. So, Mrs. Mercer to be, you want to help me drive these cattle to Coldwater and rub Lassiter's nose in it from 80 miles off?" "Get me a horse," Lydia said. And so the 11 days before the wedding were not spent on lace or cake or any of the soft things a woman might be forgiven for wanting after the life she'd had. They were spent in the saddle, the two of them, dawn to full dark, hazing cattle down out of the high draws, roping and branding the unbranded slicks until Lydia's hands were raw inside her gloves, and her whole body ached in places she'd forgotten she had. She'd never worked cattle in her life, and she was clumsy at first, and Caleb didn't coddle her, just showed her once and expected her to learn, which was, she found, exactly how she liked to be taught. By the 3rd day, she could turn a steer. By the 5th, she could swing a rope passable, and Caleb watched her drop a loop over a yearling's horns and said, "Huh," which meant more to her than the word had any right to. They talked while they rode. There was nothing to do on the long swings up the draws but talk, and Caleb, who'd kept his mouth shut for 4 years, found he couldn't stop now that he'd started. He told her about the buyer at Coldwater, a square dealer named Pruitt, no relation, she hoped, to the Pruitt boy who'd married Sue Ann Catchings. And Caleb laughed and said the world was full of Pruitts, and most of them were no account. He told her his plans, real plans, the kind a man only makes when he's decided to live. Fence the home pasture proper, build the herd back, put hens in the hen house for good and maybe hogs, fix the porch right instead of propping it. And once, on the 4th evening, riding back down toward the lit kitchen window with the cattle bedded and the stars coming out, he told her the rest of it, the thing under everything. "I've been thinking about the stones," he said, "up the rise." She kept quiet. "I always figured I'd be buried up there too. 3 stones, Sarah and Annie and me, the whole sorry story, end of the line." He looked off at the dark mountains. Felt like the only honest end to it. The Mercers, who came to the mountain and died on it. He was quiet a while. "But that's not... I don't want that anymore. I want there to be more Mercers than just 3 names on a hill. I want..." He stopped, the way he stopped at the hard things. But he made himself go on, and she loved him for the making himself more than if it had come easy. "I want a life, Lydia, not a grave I tend, a life. With you. Kids maybe, if it comes. And someday a long time off you and me'll go up the rise too, but there'll be people down the hill remembering us, working the place, not just 2 stones nobody visits. That's what I want now. You did that. You came up here and cleaned the windows, and I went and remembered I wanted to live. Lydia rode beside him in the dark and couldn't speak for a minute. When she could, she said, "You'll never get all the way easy with it. The losing, you know that. There'll be nights it comes back on you, the fever, the digging, all of it. I won't be able to fix those nights." "I know. But you won't be on the rise alone with it anymore. That's the difference. That's the only difference I can promise. When it comes back on you, I'll be down the hall, and the house won't be empty." "That's the difference," Caleb agreed. "That's the whole difference. It's enough." They were married on a Sunday morning under the vast pale frontier sky, in the dooryard of their own ranch, with the aspens behind them gone full gold, and the cattle gathered and branded in the home pasture ready for the drive. There was no church and no preacher. The nearest of either was at the pass, and neither of them had any wish to stand up before the pass and be married, after everything. So they sent for the circuit judge who rode the territory. A dry old man named Hollis, who married folk and settled disputes and buried the dead all on the same loop, and who'd known Caleb's people back before the bad years. It was a small wedding. There was no white dress. Lydia wore the blue calico she'd bought the day she put Della Pruitt in her place, made up into something good by her own hands and her mother's sewing kit. There was no crowd, but it was not, in the end, only the two of them, because the day before the wedding, old Ferris had ridden up the track. Ferris, the milky-eyed drover who'd brought her up the mountain in the first place, who turned out to be the closest thing Caleb had to a friend in the world. And behind Ferris, to Lydia's astonishment, came a wagon carrying a handful of the pass folk. Not the cruel ones, not Della Pruitt, but the storekeeper who'd coughed his laugh, and his half-grown sons, and a widow named Hetty Combs who'd lost her own man to a winter years back, and who'd heard, the way news travels, that the Hartwell girl had stood up to Lassiter in Mercer's dooryard and told the whole valley what she was worth, and who'd decided, she said plainly when she climbed down off the wagon, that any woman who'd do that was a woman she wanted to know. "I came up to see it for myself," Hetty said, taking Lydia's two work-scarred hands in her own. "They're all talking down at the pass. Della Pruitt's been telling it like a scandal, but there's plenty of us heard it different. Heard a woman finally got what she was owed instead of what they decided to give her." Her old eyes were sharp and kind. "I lost my Tom 11 years back, and I know what it is to be a woman alone the valley's made up its mind about. I just wanted to look at the one that didn't take it lying down." And Lydia, who had ridden up this mountain 3 months ago believing she was being thrown away, who had been laughed at by 3 men and sold twice by her own brother, stood in her own dooryard in her blue calico, holding the hands of a stranger who'd driven 20 miles to honor her, and found she could not say a single word, and didn't need to, because Hetty Combs squeezed her hands and understood. Judge Hollis married them under the gold aspens and the pale sky. He kept it short, the way old men who've seen a lot of weddings and a lot of funerals keep things. He asked Caleb did he take this woman, and Caleb said he did, in a voice that carried, a voice with none of the old flatness in it. He asked Lydia did she take this man, and Lydia looked at Caleb Mercer, at his scarred hands and his pale gray eyes and the hard, worn face that the whole valley feared and that she had watched crack open into something tender. And she thought of all the men who'd looked at her and seen too much, and of the one man who'd looked at her and seen exactly enough. And she said yes, the same. Yes, she'd given him in the dooryard with Lassiter's dust still hanging in the air, clear and steady and meant. And then they were married, and Ferris let out a whoop that startled the hens, and Hetty Combs cried, and the storekeeper's boys set off a string of firecrackers they'd brought all the way up the mountain, and Lydia laughed her big belly laugh, the one 3 men had rejected, the one her husband had asked to keep forever. And it rang out over the gold aspens and the gathered cattle and the living ranch, up the rise toward the 2 kept stones where the wild roses moved in the wind, out across the whole vast frontier morning, the laugh of a woman nobody would carry, married now to a man who'd carry her gladly the rest of his days and be carried in turn, because that, in the end, was the only kind of carrying that ever held, the kind that went both ways. That night, after the pass folk had gone back down the mountain, and Ferris had bedded down in the barn, and the firecrackers were nothing but a smell of powder on the cool air, Caleb and Lydia stood out on the mended porch in the dark and looked up at the stars, the same hard stars she'd lain under her first sleepless night on his ranch, with a candlestick in her fist. Drive starts tomorrow, Caleb said. 80 miles to Coldwater. It'll be hard going, and there's no guarantee Pruitt pays what I hope. And Lassiter could still find a way to make trouble between here and there if he's got men watching the trail, which he might. He put his arm around her, careful and then not careful, pulling her in against his side. It's a fool's errand, by rights. Easier to just keep on as we were. Easier, Lydia said. There's that word again, the one you said the first time, about the past folk being scared of you. Easier. Yeah. She felt him smile in the dark, a thing she could feel now even when she couldn't see it. I'm about done with easier. Easier's just another word for not living. You taught me that, Mrs. Mercer. You and a clean window. And they stood on the porch of the ranch that too much people had hauled back from the dead. Married now, with 80 hard miles and an angry rich man and the whole uncertain frontier ahead of them. And neither one of them would have traded the hardness of it for all the easy in the world, because they had each learned, late and clumsy and afraid, the one true thing, that being carried by somebody who sees the whole of you, edges and all, is worth any number of miles and any amount of trouble, and the long odds besides. The drive started at first light, and it was as hard as Caleb had promised, and harder in the ways he hadn't, because no man can fully predict 80 miles until he's inside them. They pushed out at dawn with 163 market-ready steers, the best of the gathered herd, Caleb working the left flank and Lydia the right, and Ferris, who'd announced the night before with the calm of a man stating weather that he'd ride with them, no discussion, holding drag behind the slow ones. The cattle were range sour and not used to being pushed, and the first morning was a chaos of bawling and breaking, and Lydia riding hard to turn a steer that had decided it would rather go back up the mountain than anywhere a person wanted it to go. And when she finally turned it, breathless and dusty and furious at the animal, she looked up and found Caleb watching her from across the herd with something close to that mischief again. "Don't say huh," she called across the backs of the steers. "Wasn't going to," Caleb called back. "Was going to say that one's got your same stubbornness. You're well matched." Ferris, coming up behind, said nothing, but his whole face creased around the milky eye, and Lydia thought that this was what it felt like to be on the inside of a joke instead of the outside. And it was better by a long measure. They made 14 miles the first day, which Caleb said was decent, and camped on a flat by a creek with the cattle bedded and a fire going and hardtack and beans and the coffee that was always too hot, but that tasted like something earned after a day like that. Ferris went to sleep sitting up with his back against his saddle, which was apparently how he'd always slept, and Caleb and Lydia sat by the fire in the dark and didn't say much, the comfortable kind of not saying, two people tired in the same way, the day between them like something built and done. "Second day's the worst," Caleb said. "Everything that didn't hurt today'll hurt tomorrow." "That's your version of encouragement, is it?" "I don't do encouragement. I do honest." "Well, you're very good at honest," Lydia said. "You're one of only 3 honest people I've ever met in my life. My mother was one. Hetty Combs is another." She looked at him across the fire. "You're the third, and the most inconvenient." He smiled at her. The real smile. The one that had been buried on the rise for 4 years, and that came out now easier every time. Rough around the edges, and nothing like handsome, but entirely, wholly his. She had come to love that smile, the way you love a thing that costs somebody something to give you. She was right about the second day. On the second day, her whole body rose up in protest. Hips and back and the muscles down her inner legs she hadn't known existed as separate things until that morning, and she got on her horse through gritted teeth and she kept on, because there was no other option, and because she would have ridden that drive on her hands and knees before she'd have let Caleb see her give up over soreness. By mid-morning, she'd worked through the worst of it and found a kind of grim forward momentum that carried her through. And by the third day, she'd forgotten her body entirely, the way it happens on a long ride, the body becoming just the thing you're using to do the work. The trouble Caleb had worried about didn't come where he'd expected, not from Lassiter's men on the trail, though twice on the second day, Lydia saw distant riders tracking them on the high ground, and her stomach tightened and she moved her horse closer to the herd without saying why, and Caleb saw her do it and nodded once. The riders never came down. Whether they were Lassiter's men or just range riders with no stake in anyone's business, they stayed distant and eventually weren't there, and the drive kept on. The trouble came from the land, which it mostly does. On the 4th day, they hit the river crossing at Barrows Ford. and the river was running full and fast with the tail end of mountain snowmelt, higher than Caleb had seen it in 3 years, and getting 163 nervous steers across fast-running water was the kind of problem that revealed exactly what a person was made of. The first 20 steers went in fine. The 21st spooked at something under the water, turned mid-crossing, and set off a panic that pushed half the herd back toward the near bank in a churning wall of horn and muscle that would have put a lesser rider into the water. Lydia rode into it. She didn't think, she just went. The way she hadn't thought on the night she'd heard the 3-beat limp of Caleb's lamed horse, the body moving before the head could argue. She pushed her horse into the edge of the panicked bunch and yelled herself hoarse and slapped rumps with her rope and held her ground when the horse wanted desperately to be anywhere but there. And slowly, over 10 of the most purely frightening minutes of her life, she and Caleb working from two sides with Ferris hammering drag, they turned the panicked cattle back into the ford and got them across, every last one, and stood dripping on the far bank in the late afternoon with the herd blowing and the river behind them, and Ferris's ancient voice saying, "Well, that's done then," as though they'd merely fixed a fence. Caleb rode up beside her. He looked at her, all of her, dripping and shaking and wild-eyed, and he said, "You all right?" "Ask me tomorrow," Lydia said. "Today I might say something unbecoming." And he laughed, and the laugh went out over the river and the settling cattle and the big sky. And it was the fullest she'd heard it yet, growing easier every day. And somewhere between the laugh and the river and the sky, Lydia understood that this was what the rest of her life looked like. This exact thing, hard and wet and frightening and ridiculous, with this man beside her laughing at the edge of the disaster that had just passed, and she found she wanted every year of it. They came into Coldwater on the afternoon of the 7th day. Lydia had never seen a railhead town, and if she'd imagined one, she'd have been wrong about it. It wasn't a grand thing, just a wide, muddy street and a stock pen and a cattle scale and a row of rough buildings that had come up fast to serve the trade, the kind of town that was purely functional and didn't pretend otherwise. But there were cattle buyers sitting on the porch of the largest building, and one of them stood up when he saw the Mercer herd coming down the street, and that was Pruitt the buyer. A lean, straight man in a good hat, nothing fancy, the kind of man you could read for honest before he'd said a word just by the way he stood. Caleb swung down and they shook hands, and Pruitt walked the herd, not quickly, looking, and then he came back and named a price. It was higher than Caleb had hoped. Lydia saw it hit him, that number, saw the thing that happened in his face. Not just relief, not just satisfaction, but a reckoning. A man understanding all at once exactly how much he'd lost in 4 years of letting his ranch die, and how much was still possible going forward. She stood at his shoulder and said nothing while he and Pruitt settled the details. And when it was done and Pruitt's hand was out, Caleb shook it, and then he turned to Lydia and he said simply, "We'll cover the debt and have seed money left over. Good seed money, enough to start right." "I know," she said. "How do you know? You didn't hear the number." "I saw your face." He looked at her a moment, and she saw again what she'd first seen up among the aspens. The wall gone, the raw thing behind it, except the raw thing now wasn't only grief, but something else too. Something that had been growing in him since the day she'd pulled him out of the cold and called him by his first name. Gratitude too big to name, and love too real to dress up pretty, and a kind of wonder that the world had let him have this, a second chance, a woman who could read his face. He put his arm around her right there on the main street of Coldwater, in front of Pruitt and his men and the whole busy railhead afternoon, and he said, "You know, I think that's the thing I love most about you, out of everything, that you just know." "Add it to the list," Lydia said, "after the windows and the cornbread and the way I tell your cattle where to go." Pruitt's face was admirably composed. Ferris coughed the cough. They ate a proper meal in Coldwater that night, the first they'd had that a restaurant cook had made. And it wasn't as good as Lydia's cooking, and she said so without apology. And Caleb agreed, and Ferris said he'd have settled for anything that wasn't hardtack, and it was the closest thing to festive any of them had managed in years. Caleb paid Ferris what he owed him, and then some, and Ferris looked at the money and looked at Caleb and said, "About time you got yourself back. Wondered how long you'd keep on being dead when you weren't." And he pocketed the money and went to sleep in the livery. They rode home in 4 days, lighter without the herd, and the mountains came up ahead of them, and Lydia watched them come, The familiar skyline, the pass, the draw, and felt the things settle in her that she recognized now as the feeling of going home. Not the farm she'd been born on, not anywhere she'd been before she came up this road behind old Ferris's wagon. This one, the one she'd made. Caleb rode beside her and watched the mountains too. And he said, "Lassiter'll know by now. Coldwater talks, and the pass talks. And there'll be men who saw us come down Main Street with a Mercer brand on 160 head, and the number Pruitt paid won't stay quiet long." His voice was steady, but she heard what was under it. Not fear exactly, but a readiness, the man checking his own courage the way you check a cinch before a hard ride. "Good," Lydia said. Caleb glanced at her. "He wanted to wait us out," she said. 4 years waiting for a broke man to fall over. And instead he's going to hear that the broke man drove a herd to Coldwater and came home flush. Let him hear it. Let him sit in his big house and do the arithmetic and understand that he waited 4 years for nothing, and now the man he was waiting on has a wife and money and the whole rest of his life ahead of him. She looked at Caleb. That's worse to a man like Lassiter than anything you could do with a rifle. You won, not by fighting him, by surviving him. Caleb turned that over a while. He won't let it sit. He'll find some way to... Maybe he will. And we'll deal with it when he does, same as we've dealt with everything else. Together. She said it flat and practical, the way she said all the true things. You've been fighting alone so long you forgot there's another way. You're not alone now. When Lassiter comes for the next thing, he'll have to reckon with both of us. And I promise you, Caleb, I am considerably harder to deal with than a man he's already decided is beaten. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know that. I've known it since you told me what wanted saying at my own breakfast table the first morning you were here." She smiled, not the big laugh, just the private one, the one that was only his. "You ate all the cornbread." "I did," he said, without a trace of apology, and they rode on home. What happened to Lassiter in the months that followed was not a dramatic thing. There was no final confrontation, no rifle drawn in a dooryard this time, no grand showdown on a dusty street. That was the thing nobody warned you about in stories. The real victories were mostly quiet, mostly made of time and stubbornness, and they looked like a succession of ordinary days strung together until the enemy simply ran out of patience. Lassiter did send a man up to the ranch that autumn, a lawyer with papers claiming some boundary dispute over the eastern pasture line, a thing which had enough legal language to intimidate most folk and which was clearly manufactured to do just that. Lydia sat at the kitchen table and read every word of those papers. She could read, she'd told Caleb on the first night, and she meant it thoroughly. And when the lawyer came back for an answer, she met him on the porch and told him, point by point, exactly where his papers were wrong and why. And she said it in the kind of plain, precise language that made it clear she'd grown up working beside a man who'd taught her to read and hadn't wasted the education. The lawyer went away and didn't come back. The boundary papers didn't resurface. That winter was hard but expected. They knew it was coming and they prepared for it, put up food, mended the fences right, kept the cattle from drifting high where the wolves were worst. Caleb still walked the yard some nights. She'd been honest with him. Some nights it would come back. The cold woke something in him she couldn't reach. But now she left the lamp burning when she heard him rise, so he could see it from the yard, the lit window, and more than once she got up and put her coat on and went out and stood beside him in the cold and didn't say anything, just stood there, and the standing beside was enough. The being not alone in it was enough. In the spring, Lydia wrote a letter to her brother. She'd thought about it all winter, whether to and what to say. There was a version of the letter that was pure scorched earth. Everything she hadn't said in the dooryard because Lassiter and his men had been standing there, every year of being passed and traded and decided about. She wrote that version first, long and furious, sitting at the kitchen table late one night after Caleb was asleep. And she read it back and folded it and put it in the stove and watched it burn. Because it was true, and it would have felt good to send, and it would have cost her more than she wanted to spend. Not for his sake, for hers. Because carrying that version of the truth was the same as carrying him with her everywhere, Tobias and his weakness, and his commerce and his sister's life. And she was done being defined by the people who'd done her wrong. The letter she actually sent was shorter. She told him she was well and married and that the ranch was paying. She told him the door was open if he came as a brother. She said she hoped Maggie was well and the babies were growing. She signed it with her new name, Lydia Mercer, and she didn't feel the smallness of the old name slide off her when she did it. She felt the size of the new one because she'd earned it, because she'd built what it stood for with her hands. Tobias wrote back. It took him 2 months, which meant he'd written it a dozen times first and thrown those away too. And the letter he eventually sent was short and halting and genuinely sorry in the way that a small man is sorry when the world has shown him the full cost of what he did. He asked if he could come up. He asked after the ranch and after Caleb, careful and respectful in the asking, the way he hadn't been on any of the other visits. He said Maggie had a new baby, a girl, and they'd named her Lydia. Caleb read the letter over her shoulder because she didn't have secrets from him. And when he was done, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I think I want to let him come up," Lydia said. "Not yet. Maybe next summer. Let him come up and see the place and meet his nephew." She paused. "There'll be a nephew by next summer." Caleb went very still behind her. She waited, watching his face out of the corner of her eye, and she saw the full weight of what she'd just said land on him, saw him take it in, all of it. The child, the future, the life that was going to keep growing whether either of them felt ready for it. She saw him go to the place he still went sometimes, the place with the 2 stones in it, the grief that would never leave him entirely, and she let him go there because trying to stop him going had never been the answer. But he came back from it faster than he used to. He put both hands on her shoulders, from behind, gentle, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and she felt him breathe. "A nephew," he said. "That's my guess. I've been wrong before." "Or a niece." "Could be. Either one will have to learn to ride and fix harness, so the distinction matters less than people think." Caleb laughed, quiet, the full laugh that had been buried on the rise and that she'd dug up along with everything else on this place. "God," he said, which was as close as either of them came to prayer, "we're going to be terrible at this." "Almost certainly," Lydia said. "We're going to be stubborn and too loud, and we're going to argue about everything, and the poor thing's going to learn more about cattle before it can walk than most people know in a lifetime. But it'll never once wonder if it's too much. I'll die before I let any child of mine sit alone in a woodshed shaking because somebody said they were too much." Her voice was steady and fierce, and she meant every word from the bones out. "Whatever they are, they'll be exactly enough. We'll tell them that every day till they believe it." Caleb held her tighter. Outside the repaired window, the spring was coming in. She could smell it, the green smell, the mud and the melt, and the first push of growing things. The hens were already making a racket about it. The windmill turned. "What you said in the dooryard," Caleb said, "when Lassiter was there. You said the world changes when it finally recognizes your worth. I think about that." He paused. "But I don't think that's quite it. I don't think the world recognized anything. The world was the same mean, stupid place it always was. I think we just stopped waiting for it to give us permission." Lydia sat with that. "You've been thinking." "Long winter." "You're right," she said. "That's exactly it. That's the whole of it. We stopped waiting for permission to be worth something." She turned in his arms to look at him. "That's what I want to tell the child. Not that the world will see you right eventually. The world might not. The world might be Harlan Voss and Lassiter till your dying day. The thing to know is that their verdict doesn't reach you unless you let it in. The thing to learn, and it's the hardest thing, it cost me 28 years to learn it, is that you can just decide. You can decide you're enough and live from that decision and let the world catch up if it wants, and not care much if it doesn't." He looked at her, this man who'd been hollowed out and whom she'd watched fill back up like a well after rain, and he said, "You're going to be a better parent than me." "No," Lydia said, "I'm going to be a different kind of terrible. Between the two of us, we might average out to decent." That summer, a boy was born on the mountain, in the house where the windows were clean and the porch was mended and the kitchen smelled of coffee and something good cooking, delivered by Hetty Combs, who'd come up 2 weeks early and installed herself in the spare room and was not to be argued with on the subject. He was large and loud and stubborn from the first hour, which surprised no one, and he came into the world with his eyes open, which Hetty said meant something, and which Lydia chose to believe. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that it was a solid name with no bad history in it, a name that could carry a person without dragging them down. Hetty held him and counted his fingers and declared him correct. Caleb held him and went so quiet that Lydia watched his face carefully, watching for the grief to come up and swamp him. And it came. She saw it come. The ghosts of the small hands that had been quick and clever and gone too soon. But he held it, and he held his son, and he didn't let the one erase the other. "Hello, Thomas," Caleb said low, to the baby who couldn't understand a word and who was already squinting at the light with a deeply skeptical expression. "You don't know it yet, but you landed well." He looked up at Lydia, and his eyes were wet again, the same honest wet she'd first seen under the aspens. We both did. News traveled, the way news travels in flat country, and couldn't help but travel in mountain country. Faster, louder, with more embellishment. The pass heard about the Coldwater Drive and the number Pruitt paid within 2 weeks of the drive completing. They heard about the wedding within 3 days of the wedding, because Hetty Combs was many things, and subtle was not one of them. They heard about the baby before Lydia had fully recovered from having him, and they heard about the fact that Lassiter's lawyer had ridden up to the Mercer Ranch and come back down empty-handed, which spread in a particular kind of whisper, the way stories about powerful men being thwarted always spread, quick and with pleasure. Della Pruitt revised her opinion of Lydia Hartwell so completely and so publicly that it was almost a kind of theater. She told the storekeeper's wife that she'd always thought Lydia was a capable woman, and she told the widow Marsh that the Mercer match was a fine one, a real frontier match, two hard people who suited each other. The storekeeper told his wife, and his wife told Lydia on a Saturday wagon trip, and Lydia said, "I'm sure she believes it now," and then put it out of her mind entirely, because Della Pruitt's opinion was a thing that had mattered once in the way a stone in your shoe matters, sharply and immediately, and now didn't matter at all. Harlan Voss had left the valley before winter. Nobody seemed entirely certain where he'd gone, and the few people who mentioned it to Lydia had the slightly embarrassed look of people recounting a thing that hadn't turned out the way they'd bet. She didn't feel triumphant when she heard it. She felt nothing much, which was its own kind of triumph, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Lassiter was harder than a man's gone reputation, because he was still there, still big, still the richest man south of the pass, still capable of making trouble if he chose. He didn't fold up and disappear because the Mercer Ranch was paying, but he stopped making moves on it. Whether that was calculation, waiting again, the long, patient predator's wait, or whether something in the failure of the lawyer visit had shifted his arithmetic, Caleb couldn't say for certain. What he said was that a man like Lassiter didn't quit, but a man like Lassiter also measured his efforts against his returns, and the return on harassing a ranch whose woman read legal documents at the porch, and whose man had already shown he'd level a rifle without blinking, was diminishing to the point of not being worth the trouble. "He'll wait," Caleb said. "He's patient." "We're more patient," Lydia said. "We've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Something to be patient for." That was the truth of it, and it was a truth that took Lydia Hartwell 28 years and an accidental marriage on the end of the world to learn, and that she spent the rest of her life trying to give away to anyone who'd take it, which wasn't as many people as she'd have liked, and more than she expected. The truth that patience built on hope is a different animal entirely from patience built on waiting to die. One sustains you. The other just prolongs the dying. She took to riding up the rise in the evenings, the way Sarah had, the way Caleb had told her Sarah did. Not to grieve. She hadn't known them. She couldn't grieve them. It wasn't hers to do. But because the light went off the mountains there in a particular way in the long evenings, and because the wild roses bloomed in their season, and because she had come to believe that the people who'd been loved in a place left something of that love in it, a warmth in the ground, a reason the aspens grew the way they did up there. And it was a good place to sit with the baby when he was fussing, or to think when thinking was what was needed. Sometimes Caleb came up too. They'd sit on the grass between the two stones and watch the light change, and let Thomas work his fists in the air and make the sounds that weren't words yet but were already full of opinion, and the silence they sat in together was the deep, comfortable kind, the kind two people build only over time and only out of having been honest with each other in the hard moments. And it was the most valuable thing Lydia Hartwell had ever been given, and the most valuable thing she'd ever given back. She thought, sitting there one such evening with the aspen leaves going gold again, the way they'd been the morning Lassiter came, and everything changed, about all the versions of herself she might have been. The one who'd taken Lassiter's contract, the one who'd shrunk down small enough to suit one of those first 3 men, the one who'd gone on keeping her brother's house, invisible, too much, swallowing the sharp things she needed to say until they'd turned in on her. The one who died of the slow kind of dying, the kind that doesn't need a grave because it happens in the middle of a living life. All those doors she'd not gone through, all that smaller life left behind on the valley road when the wagon climbed toward the mountain. She didn't believe everything happened for a reason. She'd never believed that, not even as a girl, and life had given her nothing to revise on. The fever that took Sarah and Annie had not happened for a reason. The cruelty of men with loud voices in front of mercantiles had not happened for a reason. The world was not a story with a plan to it. The world was weather, mostly, indifferent, and the best you could do was build something sturdy and tend it and hold on to the people worth holding. But she believed in this, that the thing people called too much was just the right amount waiting for the right-sized life. That she had been, all along, exactly enough, and the years of being told otherwise were the years of standing in the wrong doorway, and all she'd needed was to be pointed at a different door, even by a brother who was selling her, even for the wrong reasons. Pointed at a harder door, an uncertain one, a door at the end of the world that opened onto a dying ranch and a grieving man and 80 miles of trouble and a life that asked everything of her every single day. She had been pointed at that door, she had gone through it, and on the other side was this. The man coming up the rise toward her with his long stride, the baby in his arms loud about something, the mountains going blue and the roses moving over the stones, the worked and living land below them, the clean windows with the light coming out. Caleb sat down beside her in the grass, and the baby grabbed his beard with both fists and pulled, which was the baby's current delight and Caleb's current penance. And Caleb made the face he made, and Lydia laughed, the big helpless laugh, the one that came from her belly and that she had stopped apologizing for. "You think about them?" she asked, meaning the stones. "Every day," Caleb said simply. "Not the same way I used to. Used to be like standing in the bottom of it, the missing. Now it's more like..." He worked his hand free of Thomas's grip gently. "Like carrying something. It's heavy, but you get strong enough. You don't put it down, you just get better at the carrying." Lydia leaned her shoulder against his. "That's the whole of it, isn't it? That's everything anybody ever learns. You don't put it down. You get better at the carrying." He put his arm around her and the baby grabbed her hair with the hand that had just released the beard, and she winced and reached up and uncurled the small fingers. And Thomas looked at her with Caleb's pale eyes, steady and already skeptical of the world. A baby who had been born on a mountain at the far end of a hard road and who would grow up knowing in his bones that the people who loved him had chosen each other out of the wreckage of harder lives, and maybe that would mean something to him someday. Maybe it would be the thing he carried when his own hard times came, the knowledge that his parents had been the laughingstock of a valley and the best people in it, simultaneously, for years. The light went off the mountains. Down below, the windmill turned, and the cattle moved dark against the last gold of the pasture, and the lit kitchen window glowed warm against the coming dark. The same window she had scrubbed clean with her own hands the first week she was here so the light could get out. Lydia Mercer, who had been Lydia Hartwell, who had been the woman everyone rejected, who had been too much for 3 men and 1 whole valley, sat on the rise among the aspens with her husband and her son and the graves of the people he had loved before her. And she looked at her life, all of it, the whole imperfect, hard-won length of it, and she did not think, "I changed to deserve this." She thought, "I stayed exactly who I was until I found the place that was built to hold it." That was the difference. That was always the difference. The world hadn't given her permission. She'd stopped waiting for it to. And the wind came down off the cold high peaks and moved the roses over the stones, and the mountain held all of them, living and dead, in its vast and patient dark, and the lamp burned in the window below, and the ranch that 2 broken people had hauled back from the edge of nothing went on breathing and breathing and breathing.